Well, good morning, Little Masters, and welcome back to today's Tolkien Times. I'm Alan, the Man of the West, also from the Prancing Pony podcast, and I want to go ahead and get started with Word Nerd Wednesday. Now, we've talked about dwarves, and we've talked about Ents, and today it's time to look at another of the peoples of Middle-earth as we look at that wonderfully condescending term the big folk use to refer to hobbits, Halfling. Now, if you're like me and like Sean, who have each rolled thousands of D20s over our lifetimes, some even before we read Tolkien, you've certainly heard of halflings. After all, halflings is the legally permitted and license-friendly word for a vaguely hobbit-like race of little people really common in video games and tabletop RPGs. Most publishers use halfling instead of hobbit to avoid evoking Tolkien's work quite so directly, not to mention avoiding hearing from the rights holders at Middle-earth Enterprises. Of course, it also allows a game to put their own stamp on the race of halflings and not be limited to all the characteristics of hobbits as described by Tolkien. But just like Tolkien brought dwarves with a V back to the world, and you can see week one's Word Nerd Wednesday for that, Tolkien pretty much invented the word halfling too, more or less. In the nomenclature of The Lord of the Rings, Tolkien explains that halfling is, quote, not actually an English word, but might be. In other words, it is suitably formed with an appropriate suffix, end quote. But when we look at Ring of Words, a book I finally had to buy for myself after Sean left the PPP. So this is that book, highly recommended. For those of you seeing it on YouTube, for those of you listening to it on podcast, there will be a link in the show notes. In fact, halfling did exist, though with a very slightly different meaning, quite a long time before Tolkien used it in this specific way. The OED says that it is a Northern and Scots word, and gives examples as far back as the late 17th century. It means one not fully grown, a stripling, which is, of course, how a hobbit superficially appears to a human being. Now, Ring of Words gives an example of how Bergil, Baragon's son in Minas Tirith, says to Pippin, I am 10 years already and shall soon be 5 feet. I am taller than you, and point out that this is a little younger than the age ascribed to the adjectival use of halfling by the OED, which is not fully grown, about the age of 15. Now, they go on to point out that ling is a familiar suffix forming nouns for persons whose nature or status is indicated by the first part of the word, like nursling or weakling. It is also found in Easterling. Then they point out that you can also find it in Tolkien in beardling, a derisive term for a dwarf used by the orcs of Moria. And you can check that out in Appendix A3. Now, way back when Sean and I first looked at this in Season 4, I think, he dug into the OED himself and found that once upon a time in Proto-Germanic, which actually sounds like the premise of a movie I'd go see, this suffix ling was actually originally itself a compound. The OED says that it doubtless arose from the addition of the suffix, which became ing in Old English, to noun stems formed with the suffix that became l in Old English. But in all the historical Germanic languages, it has the character of a simple suffix. In other words, this combination of suffixes, the l suffix and the ing suffix, was so common that it eventually became the single suffix ling. In Old English, it had the sense of a person or thing belonging to or concerned with whatever was denoted by the primary noun. Now, it continued to be applied as a suffix well into the Middle English and Modern English periods, grayling, nestling, sapling. Now, though, it's a different story. The OED tells us that personal designations using ling are now always used in a contemptuous or unfavorable sense, though this implication was not fully established before the 17th century, such as courtling, earthling, groundling, popeling, meaning papist. However, the suffix is no longer productive in the uses above explained. In other words, that is, in other far more understandable words, around the 17th century, adding the suffix ling to another word in order to form a word for a person was generally used to create derogatory words. But the suffix doesn't tend to be used anymore at all to create new words. So when Tolkien coined the word halfling, he did so absolutely knowing that the use of ling to form a common speech word for hobbits would not only have that archaic sound, because we don't use it anymore to make new words, but would also have a slightly derogatory feel to it. And that's exactly what we might expect from the men of Gondor, who can be a bit proud, a bit haughty, and a bit condescending to other races. Given that, I'm frankly amazed that Noldor didn't come up with it. Those are the same guys who coined the word Naugrim, or stunted people, for the dwarves. Now, as for the word hobbit itself, I am sure we've talked about this on the main show, but there's also a very long entry for hobbit in Ring of Words that covers its in-universe etymology of Horbitlan, and also the history of the word in English before Tolkien. But what's really interesting in that entry is the story of how the word hobbit actually got added to the OED in 1976. and how Tolkien had corresponded with the editor of the OED, an R.W. Birchfield, regarding the entry before his death. So despite what your teachers and parents told you, the word hobbit is actually in the dictionary. But if you're designing your own role-playing game, you might want to stick to Halfling or hire a good law firm. And that's it for today's Word Nerd Wednesday, but come back as we explore the wide, wild, wonderful world of words weekly on Wednesdays. And if there's a word you want to know more about, please let me know by emailing bartleman@theprancingponypodcast.com. Now, if these few minutes leave you wanting more Tolkien content, be sure to check out the Prancing Pony Podcast, where we've spent 7 years walking through the books, including a ton of philological and etymological sidebars, and just having a nice chat at the pub about our favorite author. And please join me again tomorrow on today's Tolkien Times for Third Age Thursday. It's going to be a good one. You'll love it. Please like and subscribe on YouTube. Follow or subscribe on your podcast apps to make sure that each episode gets downloaded, and follow @Tolkien Times on YouTube, Instagram, Twitter, and TikTok. Finally, as Faramir says, go with the goodwill of all good men.